Hello and welcome to 1 Samuel 22. We're looking today at one of the most disappointing, evil and depraved parts of the Old Testament. And this section is in here really to show us a couple of things. Firstly, it's to show us the depravity of humanity, that when depraved humans receive power, they become increasingly depraved in their desire to keep that power. And sadly, human history has seen that. But it's not just about a dictator, it also reflects the human heart. The human heart, by definition, is against God. It wants to seat itself in the place of God. And this type of antichrist behavior is a hallmark in the Old Testament through Saul. He wants to go after the Christ, the Messiah in David, because he himself sees himself as a type of Messiah, a type of Christ, a king, and he could have been, but because he was disobedient to God, he becomes an antichrist. He's anti-God, and we see the type of behavior Saul does in our text today that reflects that. It is relational dysfunction, it is depravity, it is evil, it is associating with people who help him be evil. And sadly, this is what Saul does right at the beginning in verse 6 of our text in 1 Samuel 22. Let me read you a couple of verses as we pick out, sadly, the eyes of Saul's behavior. Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul was seated, spear in hand, under the tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all his officials standing at his side. So remember, David had his band of misfits, Saul had his band of henchmen. They were select people from his own tribe, his mates, yes people, whose actual privilege in life was given to them by Saul. So basically they're beholden to Saul, as the next part makes reference. He said to them, "Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give you all the fields and vineyards? No. Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have all conspired against me?" In other words, Saul's becoming paranoid. And when a paranoid dictator gets paranoid, those who are closest to him, they get paranoid too. "No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse." Well, no one wants to tell Saul bad news, because even if it's true, you don't know how he's going to act. So you just hope someone else tells him. Continues on. "None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie and wait for me, as he's done today." Well, of course they're not concerned about Saul. They're just concerned about feathering their own nest. I mean, Saul's not concerned about them personally. He's only concerned about himself. And so he gets people around him that are also concerned about themselves. That is what selfishness and narcissism actually breeds. The friends that Saul has aren't friends really relationally. They're friends by circumstance. And they know that they don't want that circumstance to change. And so they keep their mouth shut about the evilness that is within Saul's own household, because Saul is the one mainly responsible. "But Doeg the Edomite." Now, if this was an old Western or an old horror film, this is where the music begins, where you know that the person is either wearing black shoes or is evil. Doeg the Edomite, he's turned up. We haven't heard about him since the time at Nob, where he's listening in to David, but we know this can't be good. And the key thing about Doeg here is that he is a man who feathers his own nest, and it's about the information he leaves out, more so than the information he includes. So this Doeg, who was standing with Saul's officials, he said, "I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine." You see, he left out the bit there about David's deception. So he made it sound like that the priests of Nob were actually conspiring with David against Saul. Now, Saul, I suspect, wasn't interested in the truth whatsoever, but it did make the desire for Doeg to tell the truth all the more not. In other words, Doeg told Saul the story that Saul would want to hear, and that made Doeg receive potentially some benefits from. The interesting thing here as a sidelight is, why did Doeg wait until now? We've had a couple of chapters since, and occasions in circumstance since David was at Nob. He's been all over the countryside, but it's only now that Doeg tells the story. One wonders that Doeg did not tell Saul because he waited for an opportunity where it was actually beneficial not merely to Saul, but to him. The story continues. "Then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and all the men of his family who were priests at Nob, and they all came to the king. Saul said, 'Listen now, son of Ahitub.' 'Yes, my lord,' he answered. Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me? You and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he rebelled against me and the lies in wait for me, as he does today." This is not your trial that you're wanting to receive. It's like the guilty verdict's already been proclaimed. He's not after evidence. He's after a confession that results in Saul receiving the knowledge about David that he wants. And so the game is up, sadly, for the priest of Nob. Ahimelech answered the king. Well, he's got to answer with the truth, because he's still a man of authority and a man of principle and godliness, as we recall from his time at the priest of Nob with David earlier on. "Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair." Which was true at the time, wasn't it? He didn't know anything about it, so why should he be held guilty? He tells the truth. But of course, Saul wants to believe Doeg, because Saul does not want those who have conspired with David to be out in the open freely. It is bad news for Saul, and so it's going to be bad news for the priests. So the king said, "You will surely die here, Ahimelech, you and your whole family." Then the king ordered the guards at his side, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord." Here's the critical moment of the text. Will those who don't really love Saul, but are in his charge, do what Saul commands? This is the old Nuremberg defense from World War II. The king made me do it. Well, the king is making them do it, but sometimes those who are there stand up for what is right. And this is what happens here. "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord." So what you have here, sadly, is Saul is going to hand over responsibility for killing the priests to a foreigner who does not even respect God's people. Those who did respect God's people respected God's people enough to say no to King Saul, even though they were in his charge. That's bravery in one part, isn't it? They said no. It did not result in them being let off, sadly. The king handed over the desire to kill all the priests, and he actually killed more than them. He obliterated the entire town, really, because it was a town of priests and their families. And so the Edomite takes revenge upon all the priesthood. And that is a sign really of the complete and utter depravity that Saul has got himself into. He is a type of antichrist, isn't he? He felt secure in his own family structure because he had yes people around him, like all dictators. He felt secure enough to get foreigners to come into his mix who were anti-Israel, anti-God, but see, so was Saul now. And he even gave them authority to kill the very people that Saul should have been putting in charge of helping people know more about God. That is the depravity that Saul's come to. And our world is a bit like that. It will be like that for Christians, that sometimes God in his sovereignty allows evil to flourish for a short time, like here in 1 Samuel 22. That may flourish in our world at various times as well. It doesn't mean that God is not mournful. It doesn't mean that God is not unaware of what's happening. God is always in control and always aware, but he does allow the freedom of man to sometimes show the depravity of the human heart in order that we may see the need for a definite Messiah, and that Messiah is Jesus Christ. He is the ultimate King, and he is the one that we put our trust in. Amen.